So I'm from the United Kingdom. I grew up in London. I knew from a very young age that history was what I wanted to do with my life. I think at the age of 9, I had this profound experience where I realized that like 4 hours had gone by and I'd been reading this book on the history of the kings and queens of England and like, where did the time go? I thought, oh my God, I'm obsessed. So it's really been my whole life. I remember my mother taking me to the National Portrait Gallery in London, and just because I really, really, really wanted to see the portrait of King Richard III, and then I couldn't believe it was the real portrait, and I was standing in front of it, and that was the age of 9. And then I realised that there was something wrong with me, and that I was going to be a historian. So I was in Britain. I did my undergraduate degree in Bristol, which was fantastic because my father owned a bookshop in Bristol, so I got to spend a lot of time with him. In my final year, when I was doing my master's degree, I lived in the bookshop. I lived in the basement, which was not right, I think, legally. I had no hot water. I had no kitchen. I had customers used to open the door by mistake, looking for Irish fiction, and they found me in bed. This wasn't great. It was a difficult year. I ate nothing but toast from the toaster, and I did a master's degree in medieval theology, more or less. But then I moved to America. I moved to New York when I was 22, and this was the start of my PhD. I met some wonderful people. I met Anne Mulhall, who is my partner, and she taught me all the important things I had to know about how to do studies and all sorts of things. And I met several other important people, Todd Foley, who's a professor at New York University. And I found a really great intellectual community. And what went from being like my personal study of the Middle Ages went to being something that I thought might actually be a career. I moved from New York. I graduated the PhD in 2014. I moved to Toronto. I was a postdoctoral fellow in the Jackman Humanities Institute for 2 years. Under the directorship of Bob Gibbs and Kim Yates. This was just a wonderful place. It was like intellectual paradise. You know, they gave me this lovely office looking at the CN Tower, and they gave me 1 class per semester and 2 years. You know, there was a coffee machine, there was a free lunch every Thursday. We got to talk about our research all the time with other humour scholars, actually. So this was like amazing. It was very cold. And I thought, I'm never going to return to a cold place after this, because this was just awful. And then we moved to Providence, Rhode Island, in the USA, where my partner Anne had a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown at the Pembroke Center for studies and research on women. This was wonderful for me. I got to start my work on the Roman Revolution, start a new project. I got to sort of keep work up on my book manuscripts on laughter. I got to meet some wonderful people. We had a baby, that was amazing. Obviously, she's a little roadie. She's a little American. We then moved immediately almost to Siberia, to Jimin, where we are now. And of course, the cold world that I tried to escape, you know, is now upon us again. And so this is the next adventure. The reason we came here really is a really unique opportunity to be somewhere that's doing something interesting with research, like collaborative work. The challenge of doing collaborative research was the real draw. The idea that we'd be in a research team, be working with people, we're not going to be lonely, you know. Often, like for me as a medievalist, I'm talking to no one. I'm just reading 12th century monks, you know, and it's, you know, and that's it. And I go home and, you know, I talk to myself because there's no one else who wants to talk about John of Salisbury or Peter Abelard or, you know. But then you know, being in a research team is great because I can bore them with that, and I can try to convince them that they need to know about John of Salisbury to understand climate change or whatever. But that's not quite true. And then the other reason we came as well, I suppose, is we wanted to be professors, I suppose, in a different context, and to, I think it's boring when you're, again, as a medievalist, it can be boring just teaching medieval history to people who have this certain preconception about what the Middle Ages is all the time. It's fantastic to teach students from a totally different context who have a totally different sense of the value and meaning of the Middle Ages, and it's a different kind of learning. So for me, teaching Russian students has been an enormous challenge. It's been enormously rewarding, and it was definitely worth the the thousands of miles and the thousands of degrees centigrade difference between our old life and this. The way I've been operating group work at SAS is based on a model invented, I think, by Anne Mulhall, Professor in Cultural Studies. And the idea really is to, on the one hand, to make group work a kind of culmination of what you've learned that week. It's kind of logical, but making those group work sessions ways for students to practically think through the things that they've learned and work with in the previous sessions of the week. The idea is to keep things fresh, to keep students working with different people, so they don't get stuck in patterns and roles. The idea is also to give them, to sharpen their research skills. So, for example, I was doing a class, The Essentials of Global History. One week we were looking at colonialism in the continent of Africa, British colonialism, and we had a lecture that talked very broadly about, how did colonization work? We talked about the slave trade, we talked about the scramble for Africa, we talked about the different wars that took place, the war in the Sahara with the French, we talked about, the Germans on the East Coast. So it was really big, broad brushstroke approach. In the seminar, we looked at how different historians have approached this, and we got much more focused. We focused on Ghana specifically, and we looked at the historiography, one view and another. And then for group work, it was like, well, let's dig even deeper into Ghana, but you do the work yourselves and collaborate. So the students I encouraged them, one group had to do pre-colonial Ghana, one group did the colonial period, and one group did sort of the decolonization process. And we had two groups doing different sides of the colonial experience. And the idea there was that they had to read primary sources. They had to go out and find the evidence for themselves. So they've had the big picture, they've had the sort of the debates that historians are having. Now they need to become the historians themselves, do the research for themselves, collaborate, and come up with a presentation that makes a strong argument, that inserts itself into these other debates that we've talked about. The idea, I suppose, ultimately is that group work is a culmination of things that they've learned. Group work is a chance to really be independent from me doing their own research, but collaborative, that they have to make agreements. What material should we focus on? What should our argument be? But I think that a lot of people are practicing this style at SAS. And as I say, it's all Anne Mulhall's invention. I think obviously I'm going to say that I'm horrified that history seems to be becoming less popular, and I think let's hope this is a temporary thing. I think it's explainable by the fact that a lot of people are going into college now thinking about, in utilitarian terms, like what will my job be afterwards? What are the practical skills, competencies that I need? Now, I think that often the front door of history can look quite useless. It could be like, oh well, I'm studying the past, but I want to be, I want to work for Google, Yandex. I'm future oriented. Why should I look at the past? And I think that there are two things here. On the one hand, I would love for students to go into university and accept that that what they study is not just to help them get jobs, it's to help them become the kind of person who's going to get a job. And that education is really about building your depth and of character and intellect, which is, and for which history is surely unparalleled, right? But on the other hand, I want to make that argument. On the other hand, I want to make the argument that history, of course, can give you all the skills and competencies you're going to need to work in Google or Yandex, which I don't want all of my students to do that. I want history to be something that lives and breathes in their lives forever. I think it's a way of thinking about the world and the human, which, is just fantastically robust, fantastically mind-expanding, and just makes for a better life in every single dimension, right? Of course, I believe that. And yet, I also want to make the argument to students who really do worry about jobs. Why shouldn't they worry about jobs? Of course. We live in a world where, competition for the labour market and all that. But you can do good work for Google and Yandex with historical skills. Why? Because history teaches you to think through vast amounts of complex material and process it and come up with unique ways of reading it. History forces you to think in terms of boiling down to essentials, boiling down to key points that are going to make your argument. History teaches you to to sit back, reflect, and meditate on what was important in this text. What did it mean, after all, that the Roman Empire fell in the year 410? How did this enormously complex thing happen? You, as a historian, we train you to take thousands of different documents, hundreds of different ways of thinking, and to sit and think and think and think and come up with an answer to this eternal question: why did something happen? And this is something which is so transferable to all your walks of life. Yes, I do think that things can be new. I think that what history teaches us is the enormous complexity and contingencies of human development and the development of civilizations and cultures, right? It's, history makes us respect just how complex these things are, that there are no patterns or laws that govern human affairs, not simple ones anyway. So yeah, and of course, I want to live in the present. I want to imagine that there's something that will surprise and shock me about the future. And yet, there are certain things that can reassure you by reading history. You can be reassured that when you see a great scandal or when you see a great crisis, that humanity has gone through these things before, or similar things at least. I suppose the short answer is that, unfortunately, there are certain problems that will never go away, and there are certain, issues in human politics or whatever that are kind of eternal. But the circumstances are always extremely fresh, and history shows us to pay attention to those complexities and specificities. And there's a podcast I really like. There's a podcast called Slow Burn, and I think this is a really impressive piece of history, actually. It's a podcast about the impeachment controversy or the impeachment process, rather, of Richard Nixon, and then the impeachment process of Bill Clinton. And there's another series which is about Tupac and Biggie, right? So it's quite a departure. What's interesting is that they announce this podcast as the question is, what did it feel like to live through this historical event in real time? What did it feel like to be living on the verge of something that you knew was significant, but you didn't know how it would play out? What was it like to wake up every morning and wonder, will Richard Nixon be impeached? Will he resign? What will happen to the presidency? In other words, this is a work of history, I think, which is really interesting because that wants to emphasize the contingency, the fact that it could have been another way, and that this concatenation of things came together to make this historical moment. And that emphasizes that people experience this in really different ways. I'm trying to think about a TV series or a film. This is very difficult. I mean, I can think of more examples of films that I don't like because I don't like their history, but not the content of their history, more that I feel that they make history something dead. That, for me, what matters is that not that we represent in TV or film what it looked like, or what would have been a realistic speech that someone made. They would never have mentioned this sort of thing, or that they would never have used a sword like that. Obviously that stuff, I'm sure that is important, but really what I think matters is that we represent what it might have felt like, and just how important these ideas and things were. For example, when we see a speech represented and there's lots of formal language, or it's, oh mine God, thy art so great, or thou art so great, or something like that, it has this fossilized quality, it's dead. It belongs to some way of thinking that is just dead, and we can't empathize with it. Whereas when I'd rather see it him speaking directly, my God, for God's sake, why? Why do you make me feel so terrible? Put it in colloquial language. Give it to us the way it felt. Give it to us the way what it meant and how it felt, rather than what it looks like to us now. In other words, see it as it looked like then, rather than what it looks like from this kind of museum perspective of putting something in a cabinet and giving it a label. Well, I think my students always say they love Game of Thrones, or a lot of them do. There are other shows like this. So, I haven't watched it, sadly, so I can't pass judgment. I think that has at least stoked some interest in the Middle Ages, which I'm delighted with. And if it brings it to life, then it's done its job, at some level.